What is going on, everybody? This is Nathan Craigfield. Welcome to Seeking Excellence Podcast. Today, I'm super blessed to be joined by my new friend. We have our mutual friend, Carrie Gress, but Noelle Mering. Thank you so much for coming on with me today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Yeah, super pumped. Emily is always jealous. She was jealous when I got to talk to Carrie. She's jealous when I get to talk to you because she has like 16 copies of Theology of Home. Because it's been like ever since we got engaged, it's like everybody's gift to her has been Theology of Home because they knew she'd love it.
I love hearing that.
Yeah, which is really cool. And we read Anti-Marriage Exposed in June. We do like a little book club together. She and I do that. And so, yeah, so that was really fun. Carrie, I think it was off the podcast. So for those who don't know, Carrie actually recommended that I read Noelle's book after doing the podcast with her. Well, you were gracious enough to send me a copy of Awake, Not Woke. Absolutely loved it. As soon as I read the title and the subtitle, I was like, this is going to be my jam. So I was a huge fan for sure. But first, I have a lot of great things I want to talk about and ask you about. But first, I would just love for you to be able to introduce yourself to our listeners a little bit.
Sure. I'm Noelle Mering, as you said. I'm wife to my husband, Adam, who was my college sweetheart. We have 6 children. We live in Southern California. We actually met at an evangelical Protestant school called Westmont College in Santa Barbara. He's a convert. He converted after, and I'm a revert. I came back to the faith somewhere around my senior year, although it was a slow uphill battle. And then we moved to Massachusetts for a while, where he's from, and then came back to California, where we've been for the last 21 years about raising kids. And I started writing just articles maybe 5 years ago, and then it turned into a collaboration with Carrie on Theology of Home 1 and 2, and then my first solo book, which is the book we're going to be discussing today, Awake, Not Woke.
That's so cool. Yeah. And one thing I want to tell you about is like, I write as well, and I enjoy writing. I enjoy good writing. And there's some of your sentences in there that I just loved. I just want to affirm you on like your writing ability, not just great ideas, but for those who, I hope everybody that listens to this will get a copy of the book, but I just really loved not only the content of it, but the way that you wrote it was really impressive. And so I just want to applaud you on that really quickly, because it was awesome.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. So first, I just want to give you some context. So what we do, Seeking Excellence, we have our 7 pillars of excellence. And so I kind of started off on this journey, the church talks about mind, body, and soul, and then kind of dove into like the Matthew Kelly adds in like the emotional pillar. He talks about the 4 parts of a person: mental, emotional, physical, spiritual. And then I kind of like, as I was going in my life, I added like professional and financial, because I started to make money. I was getting, reviewed. I was in the Army. I was an Army officer for a while, and just you get reviewed at your job and things like that, So I was like, this seems like it's pretty important, right? So I was like, professional pillar of excellence sounds right. But the social pillar, which is really what, this kind of falls under, I started to see because of something that you mentioned in the podcast I listened to you on, a separate podcast with Jesse Romero, is so many Catholics, so many people get drawn away from the faith because of these social movements that are happening. And I was like, this is too important. Like, this isn't just like some subset, like we really do have like this responsibility to be well formed in, this kind of social sphere, if you will, with all these movements and things that are happening. So I'm really curious for you. I think you said that on that other podcast, that was kind of one of your motivations to write the book, was seeing all these other people kind of falling into it. But just kind of wanted to generally ask about that. Like, what was kind of your motivation to go and actually write this?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think you indicate the answer in with the social pillar, but I have always been interested in how Christians play out their faith in the public, in the social sphere. Like, what does that look like as it interacts with politics? And is it merely political, or is there something deeper happening behind it? And I think what I started to realize was that, there were so many things that would come up throughout my adult life, even starting with, the gay marriage battles, maybe 10 years ago, and thinking, that it's so hard. I'm such a people person. Like, I really love my friends, and I always prided myself on being able to have deep friendships across party lines and across ideological lines and all these things. And so valuing those people, making them feel valued, is really super important to me. But it became to this point where I just kept thinking, well, what is the principle that we're altering here, or that what is the principle that we're doing away with as we make these policy decisions? What will that imply in the future? What consequences will this have? What does this mean about what a human person is? What does this mean about what marriage is? And how do you balance that with this desire to be compassionate and to be inclusive to other people?
Right.
And it seemed to me like it mattered far more than the way our national conversation was indicating. And it seemed really important to me because I think that I've spent a lot of my life, as most people have, I bet you have too, realizing how much ideas matter in your life personally. That if you believe
sure.
this one thing, then what does that mean that in the way you have to conduct yourself and the way you have to live your life? And what is that going to lead you to commit yourself to 10 years down the road? This old idea that ideas actually have consequences and that those consequences are incredibly important because the ideas are incredibly important.
Right.
And that implies that the idea is incredibly important. And so with the woke movement, I just started writing about it a few years ago, realizing that it just was taking on this increasingly merciless tenor, and a movement about social justice seemed utterly opposed in some ways to actual justice and ultimately to mercy. And that was really interesting to me. We were becoming a harsher culture. And I wanted to see, is this something that's really actually helping the people that it claims to want to help, much less, helping us as a whole, as a society to grow together and, to be a harmonious society where friendships are enabled. So that was really, I think the more destruction I started seeing coming out of it made me more motivated to dig into it further.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think it's so interesting. I've shared oftentimes on the podcast, like I was a registered Democrat when I was 18, was like super pro Obama in my teen years. I'm a convert to the faith and have gradually become more and more conservative over the years. But it really was a very gradual process. And I look back on the times when I like really bought in, especially to like the racial narrative of like being a victim, you know what I mean? And that being like the biggest obstacle in my life and all this stuff. And I just saw somebody today. It was a Catholic Instagrammer, kind of influencer person, who was talking about, kind of like both feminism and racism and like blaming a lot of the negativity in her life on that, kind of degrading the pro-life movement in a sense, and doing this, especially in this pivotal time of the pro-life movement. And it is so sad, like I've really almost shifted, and I think in a good way, thanks to the grace of God, shifted from like anger to somebody who's doing that to like really realizing and like really being compassionate and being like, that's like it's miserable, and
Yeah.
I've been there, and you've seen that with people.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's huge. That's a huge recognition because there is I think being in a place of finding our identity in our victimhood leads pretty quickly to resentment and a posture of anger walking through the world.
Right. Absolutely. And I want to go, I don't know if this is a direct quote, but that's kind of a great segue into one of my favorite things that you said on the podcast that I listened to earlier. And I don't know if you mentioned this in the book or not specifically, but you talked about how, the woke culture basically has the bad news and what the church offers is the good news. And I really love the way that you framed that. And I hadn't really thought about it in such a simple way before, that basically the good news is, you said, is that you are loved and therefore you ought to love. But the bad news is that you're hated and oppressed, and therefore you basically ought to hate and oppress.
And to spread and to raise people's consciousness. That is, one of the points of being an activist is there's a raising of consciousness that's steeped in Marxism, but that you're supposed to spread that bad news to other people, like wake them up to the fact that they're hated. It really isn't a
and that they ought to hate.
Gospel. Yeah, and that they ought to hate. Contra gospel message, I think, flows directly from a different definition of the human person. Are we defined by the love of God or by the hatred of man? And from those two varying definitions will come two very different missions.
Absolutely. Yeah. and lifestyles and fulfillment and all kinds of different things. But yeah, so I think thinking about that, that's obviously a very boiled down version of it, but I think really encapsulates a lot, but it's very dark, And so one thing I'm interested in, because I know from my own research, I wrote a lot about racism last year and learning about those things and just generally trying to study up and read these books like yours, and educate myself in a vast, all these different kind of topics and issues and things like that. Like, how difficult was it for you, kind of similar to C.S. Lewis when he wrote the Screw Tape Letters, like when he had to kind of take on the mind of the devil. Like, I think that in a certain sense, when you research things like this, and you obviously extensively read Karl Marx and, all these different authors, just like Carrie Gress, had to go back through all the feminists and things like that. Like, how was that experience for you of really diving deep into these evil philosophies and ideologies?
Yeah, no, I think that the darkest part for me was writing chapter 7, which is the one about innocence and victimhood. I think I titled it "The Crowd of the Victim," but that's when I really was researching how innocence is dominance according to the movement. because innocence, it's the whole thing with like why children have to go to transgender story hours at the library. They're supposed to be exposed to alternative lifestyles because their innocence of those lifestyles perpetuates the idea that there's a norm of behavior. It perpetuates the idea that these alternative lifestyles are actually alternative, that they're not the norm, the default. But in the course of writing that chapter, which I found to be really rich, because it's when sort of the spiritual underpinnings of it all really came together for me. But I did some research on abortion about this with the Church of Satan, and they have rituals, and it was dark, and I didn't write extensively about it, but I really wanted to go there and just so I could wrap my mind around what their approach to all of that was and how deeply demonic it was. And I felt, I think maybe for the first time in my life, actually, just a real presence of something demonic. And I spoke with my spiritual director about it, and he was able to, help me through it. But I think my poor long-suffering husband, every night we would sit on the deck and I'd be like, and this is what I'm reading about today. And this is what I found out. Right. And he'd be like, okay, that's pretty heavy. Right. Having your spouse be able to process it all with you. Oh my goodness. I recommend that to anyone who's going to write a dark book.
Yeah. You got to have the debrief partner. It's so big.
It's consuming. It can be consuming. It can be, consuming. My gosh. But the nice thing is that the faith is like, is there such a lightness about it, that you can feel this total confidence in the face of something so dark and so evil. The exorcists talk about this, that, you unite yourself to Christ and that he's your victor, and he gives you all the protection and confidence that you need.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so good. And I've experienced that even just like, if you listen to certain podcasts, right? So like, I love Ben Shapiro and Matt Walsh, and I still have to, like, I got to take a vacation every now and then, I'm like, I pray for those guys because I'm like, they're so mad every day. I'm like, that can't be good for your heart health long term.
Oh yeah. Well, that's the other flip side. It's just on a more natural level. It is hard not to become, we don't want to fight ideology by becoming ideologues of another stripe, right, where we're just purely political, and tribal and just kind of rah-rahing our guy and dunking on the libs and something. That's never, I've always been very aware of that temptation, and I feel it in myself, and I disdain it. So I try to work really hard to struggle against that temptation, because it is a pull. There's a real pull there.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's just something that, as I remember, we had a priest friend of ours over here for dinner about 2 months ago or so. And he was just like, we were just talking about all these different things going on in society and all this stuff. We were, Ben Shapiro topics and all these things. And he was just like, yeah, I just try to stay away from a lot of that, because he's like, I just have enough of a mess of my own life, that he's like, I don't even try to venture into that, which I think is, a good point, especially when you get to the point where it is like affecting your mental health and like you are, not being loving towards your neighbors or people who disagree with you and things like that. But what is your kind of perspective on that? Like the focus on, federal politics, the national movements, like all these different things that are happening versus like having your own affairs in order. Because it's a tough combination. Jordan Peterson talks a lot about that. He's like, clean your own room before you go out and criticize the world. But at the same time, like he goes and speaks on like these large, wide scale issues. And I don't think we're at a point where we can just totally ignore those.
Right. No, that's actually a fantastic question, and one that I think about a lot. It's interesting because like Alexander Solzhenitsyn would say, the biggest one of the biggest errors of the ideologue is that he thinks that evil cuts through groups of people, whereas evil cuts through the hearts of every one of us. So we're all capable of malevolence. We're all capable of deep evil, and we're all capable of triumphant goodness, and that sort of the Catholic. I think I've written a couple of articles about this, just that how the Catholic Church really is on a natural level such a buffer against ideology. Why? Because, so for example, I try to go to confession weekly, which I every week I hate. And it's not even because there's, necessarily all these huge, awful things. It's just because it's really humbling to tell a priest who you love and want, and, I identify who I am and who I want him to like me, and be like, well, still struggling with this, or still, right. It's extremely humbling. But the Catholic Church sets you up on a path that's going to keep you always, as much as we want to get into the place of accusing and finding evil outside of ourselves, we are constantly invited and prompted to see the darkness within ourselves and to struggle against it, and to pick up our struggle anew, the next day, and begin again. And that opportunity, I think, is such a deep and profound way to ward ourselves against that temptation of becoming just wrapped up in, kind of the battle of the evil outside of ourselves. The church is always, and also family life. I mean, I always say family life, it's terrible and beautiful. It's terrible because you see your own faults. You can't hide your faults. You
Right.
can't bifurcate yourself. But it's beautiful because you get to contend with your faults. You get to improve. But I think that the plight of modern man and woman oftentimes today is a bifurcation where, they have the person they're projecting out in the world, and then the person that they're kind of pretending they're not, who is their real selves. I think we've become performers so quickly and easily, and it's a human temptation, but I think that's all tied together in what you're talking about. And the best way, as you say, to fight against it is to really get your own house in order, as you
Right.
said earlier, as Jordan Peterson would say. And oftentimes people are disappointed that message, like, so I just need to pray more. It's like, well, kind of. I mean, there are more practical solutions too.
It's a
but
big part of it.
the holier we become, the more we die to ourselves, the more we, conquer our own egos, the more we're going to reflect like Christ in the world, the better our families are going to be, the better our friendships are going to be. It has exponential, improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. It is so interesting. It's such a good point that you made there about the fact that our faith really does keep us grounded and like recognizing our own capability for evil and wrongdoing and sin and things like that in the world. And I think, one part that made me think of in the book was you talked about one of the head guys of the Nazis that kind of ran the concentration camps and really, did just horrific things. And I forget which chapter it's in. It's kind of in like the last quarter of the book, I think, or like in the middle third. But you talked about how, somebody who was watching the trial of this guy, I can't remember what his name was, but basically that what she came to realize is that she was startled by how ordinary the man seemed.
Yeah.
And how much we think all the time that like evildoers, these horrific people, are just so different from us,
Right.
like they're just so far away. And I think that as a Catholic, you would almost be more grounded to not be as surprised by that, because if you are practicing Catholic and you are going to confession regularly and you have this high standard for yourself and you see the terrible things that you've been able to do, I think it does kind of open you up to that to a certain extent. But it's really powerful. And I think the other thing that you said that was really powerful in that, that you pointed out that she said was that he had a very authentic inability to critically think.
Yeah. That was Hannah Arendt, I think. Yeah.
Yep. And so just like how powerful that is, because that's something that I have pointed out for the last several years and have just been mind blown by people's inability to like comprehend any sort of philosophy and to really like rationalize and like think through issues. Cause that's all that really made me more conservative. That's all that made me more pro-life and more pro-traditional marriage and more pro all of these things, right? Was just like the ability to think. So what is kind of your just take on that? Like, how do you think the world has kind of started to deconstruct the ability to critically think?
Yeah, no, I started in the beginning intro or for chapter 1, I talk a little bit about the idea that, the modern kind of banal phrase where people say it's better to be kind than right. That phrase always rubs me so wrong. And I think because, obviously there's cases where, you're not supposed to be pedantic scold, or, if someone says, do I look fat? You're not supposed to necessarily say the bull truth.
You look huge. Yeah.
But I think that phrase is representative of this kind of banal truism that goes far beyond that sort of admonition, but rather is kind of just inculcating us into this idea that truth and love are separate things, and that if you're focused on truth, you're ignoring the deeper and more important task at hand, which is totally anathema to what truth and love actually are, right? They're not opposed to one another. In fact, truth without love is a lie, and love without truth is not really loving.
Right.
Or I think Pope Benedict said, love without truth is mere sentimentality. And then there's another great quote. Flannery O'Connor says, love without the cross is tenderness, or something without Christ, or tenderness without the truth leads to the gas chambers. Anyway, but my point being that I think that kind of instinct has led to a real relegating of critical thinking, off to something that is reduced, and unimportant. I think that's kind of what the popular story that's happened is that we've, even with like the issues of sexuality, that whole thing. Or any other issue. I mean, like we were talking about at the beginning, it's always just really driven me crazy to think like, well, what is the principle behind what we're promoting, and if we don't care about that,
Right.
then we're gonna walk into a whole host of issues that we're not anticipating. So we have to think about what our principles are. But I think the more academic thing, that's the story that could be told, is that, this was just part and parcel of the Frankfurt School and the neo-Marxist movement, was to replace critical thinking with critical theory. Critical thinking is oriented towards truth, and critical theory is oriented towards power. And that got seeded all throughout the academic institutions. So kids have just been weaned on this stuff. And I really think it's prohibited a lot of depth of thought. And this is why you get sloganeering, right? I think that's in that chapter too, is that people tend to become sloganeer, like hooked on slogans, because it masks the inability to think.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting today, in today's world, how far so many slogans have gotten, like things like healthcare as a human right, or abortion is healthcare, and like how tied those two things can be without people. I mean, it's incredible to me how many pro-choice people there are in the world today who don't even really have an argument or philosophy or stance on whether or not it's a human life in the womb, right?
Yeah.
Like the devil has done such a great job of getting us so far away from like the fundamental like premise question, that like all the premises are almost assumed by so many people, that it's just like, you hate women if you're trying to, eliminate abortion.
An emotionally driven narrative. And that
Exactly.
emotionally driven narrative carries and masks the fact that there is no substance there.
Yep. Exactly. But I love what you said there. And you mentioned this earlier about like, where does it lead? Ben Shapiro, these guys talk a lot about like the fence. You find a fence. I think it's a Chesterton quote originally, where it's like, you find a fence in an open field, and it's like, do we tear down the fence? And you have to have the fear at least, or at least wonder what's on the other side. What could this fence be protecting us from, or keeping us, safe, or keeping us away from? And one thing I think is interesting, and kind of like the slippery slopes, you mentioned like the same-sex marriage debate that was going on 10, 12, 15 years ago. And, it's so interesting to see how many different things. I read A Church in Crisis by Ralph Martin, and he talks about, I used to think that, the same-sex debate, when same-sex marriage was legalized, like that's what's led to a lot of the gender ideology and things like that. He pointed, or no, it wasn't Ralph Martin. It was It Is Right and Just by Scott Hahn. He put it all the way back to like no-fault divorce being like the kind of top of the slippery slope. And I think that it's one of the challenges that we face. Jordan Peterson also talks about like, you have, he says that when he started fighting back against mandatory pronoun usage, that a lot of people said, well, this is kind of an arbitrary place, because he said he would use a transgender person's pronouns if they asked him to, but he didn't think it should be mandated. And I'm interested to hear your opinion on this. Like, he said that wherever you draw the line is almost always somewhat arbitrary, because you have to just kind of do it somewhere. But how do you keep it from going so far? And what do you think is the reason why so many people refuse to draw the line? Do you think it is just this kind of culture of niceness that we have? Or why do you think so many Catholics just continue to say, just to be, I'm going to be nice, I'm going to use transgender people should, have bathrooms, and they should be able to use whatever restroom they want in schools, and all these different things that are happening with wokeness? Like, why do you think people are so afraid to draw that line somewhere?
Yeah, I think I can answer in a couple different ways. I'm just speculating. One, I think, is the frog in the boiling pot of water syndrome, where you're not. I remember reading this. I think it was E. Michael Jones, who I haven't read very deeply or broadly, but he had an article out 15 years ago or something, and he was saying, if any, when he was growing up, if MTV had come on the screen, every father in his block would have picked up their TV and thrown it in the trash, but that the culture just slow boils you into more and more, until all of a sudden you're at the bacchanal. But
Absolutely.
But I also wonder if there is an element of, because we have become so hyper political, which I think is also a point of ideology, is that everything becomes political becomes the god, and so everything personal has to become political. And I think that really makes politics become encompassing something that it cannot bear. The state begins to try to become a god in a way. But then what does that do? As we become less religious, we become more political. Our politics we relocate our religion to our politics. And I think that people have a hard time drawing that line, because once they've let the line go, and it's a certain number of fronts, then they've steeped themselves more and more into this political alignment. And then at that point, it becomes so tribal, it's really hard to kind of question your whole tribe, when you've given away so much ground. But I do think, that being said, that people are, I think the transgender movement in some ways is, I see a lot of more liberal family and friends who are questioning it in a way that they wouldn't have felt comfortable questioning gay marriage, for example, or even some aspects of the sexual revolution. I mean, I think that's interesting about no fault divorce, because I really think this transgender movement is so connected to the sexual revolution, just that idea that our bodies don't mean anything. So we can do, if once we decide our bodies are meaningless, and, you might as well mutilate it.
Right.
But I think that it is a grab, progressive grab that is rubbing a lot of people the wrong way. And I wonder if more lines will be drawn now.
Yeah, if people will start to realize we might have gone too far. I think it is interesting, but it kind of goes back to that people's lack of ability to critically think, and I think a lack of ability to philosophize in any way. Because I always say, you can start to predict. We see the little hints of it now if you follow conservative news outlets, of like pedophilia being kind of normalized and things like that. But I'm always like, how do you make the distinction that men and women can get married, and that, or two men can get married, they can adopt kids, and then fight back at all against transgender ideology? And then if you allow transgender ideology to go down younger and younger in age, and the sexualization of children that's been going on, how does that not lead? Like, my question to people all the time is, how does that not lead to pedophilia? Yeah. If a child can choose their gender at age 3, 4, or 5, why can they not give sexual consent at 12? It's a disgusting rationalization, to like go that far. But if these are your premises where you say that this is okay, it's inevitable that we're going to get to that point, So yeah, I mean, we hope, and I think that when children start getting more involved, it seems like that's what wakes people up. But
yeah, no, I hope so. But and I think that's an excellent point, that I think we need to see where there's a limiting principle to something in order to understand what it is. Right. And I think people oftentimes say, "Oh, you're just saying a slippery slope, or you're paranoid or something." But if we as a society eradicate limiting principles about a thing, then by definition it's going to become limitless. It's going to keep moving. It's going to keep going.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it's crazy. Oops. I think
We okay? Oh, I can't hear you.
Let's see. Is that?
Oh, wait, now I can't.
So one thing I wanted to jump into, there's a few, I mean, you had some great quotes in the book, so I wanted to read some of your great sentences, but one thing that I really, really loved was the way that you broke down I think it's here in part 2, when you talked about dogmas, and you talked about the 3 rolling woke dogmas. So I want to talk about those for a little bit real quick. And so you said the first of the 3 is the primacy of group over the person. The second one is an emphasis on will at the expense of reason or nature. The third is the elevation of human power, rejection of a higher authority. So first, can you talk about how you think we started to kind of make that transition from group over a person, and how, especially here in the United States, it's almost impressive. You know what I mean? Like literally the entire point of America, right, is like this elevation of the individual to be like the almost, in a Catholic sense, almost like too high of authority figure, or too idolized, I guess you could say, or prioritize, over God in certain senses, with like the full like liberal view of America, like in classical liberalism. But even so, like how did this kind of happen, where wokeness really started to put group over individuals?
Yeah, no, well, I think that was a key tenet, is this, that introducing especially children into a collectivist mindset, which is, I think we're seeing the flourishing of that happening with all the stuff happening in schools right now. But yeah, I mean, it's a self-deifying movement that kind of both makes the individual like a god and also a totally enslaved, right? That's the irony of it. But I think it's, so maybe the easiest phrase would be identity politics, is, what this first dogma is pointing to. Mary Eberstadt has a great book called Primal Screams, I think, or I'm not sure of the name, but it's basically saying, she connects it, which I think is completely right on, to the fact that we have lost so much our primary identity as in family. And that once that happens, which was a real, that was a deliberate, that was a deliberate social pathology that the movement wanted to introduce, is to destroy the family. Family abolition has been a historical part of the woke movement from way before it was called woke.
Right.
But once you lose that kind of primary identity, you're on search for any identity on offer. I think about it like a kid who doesn't have anyone looking out for him or protecting him and is more susceptible to being pulled into a gang because he wants some semblance of a family, even if it's a family that's built not on love, but rather on threat or, transactional protection type of deal. It still feels like he has some place to belong.
Right.
And I think identity politics really rose from that desire, that very human desire. It gives you a narrative, right? It gives you a story. I am part of this movement. And it was happening alongside and possibly as a cause of a rise in a society-wide elevation of our victim status as being part of where we gain our moral stature. So the more we find that we can claim some sort of victim mantle, the more we have a platform from which we ought to be heard and from which people need to listen. And that really creates an incentive to find ways in which we've been harmed. And if we can claim that in a group, then that gives us a certain amount of protection. It gives us a certain amount of gravitas, and it gives us a certain amount of, elevation, and it gives us something special about ourselves, and none of that is obviously to say that there are not groups I'm from a biracial family. My mom grew up with a lot of racism, and I understand that is real, and that I have no way, and I have to say this because I've sometimes had people say, like, do you not think that racism is real? I was like, of course I understand it's real. I just didn't know I had to say that because every normal person believes it's real.
Right. Yeah.
Every reasonable person understands that. So I want to make that caveat, but there's a difference between understanding that it is real and that it is an evil, and saying that we therefore need to identify ourselves by that evil,
right.
in that, in that group.
Yeah. And view everything through that lens.
Yeah.
Which is an incredible, it's just an incredible thing. Like, I'm so mind blown. It's one of the things that, like, I'm surprised isn't more awakening for people. We stand right now when we're recording this, like 2 weeks maybe after the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict has come out, and then you had I don't know how to say the town in Wisconsin. Waukesha. Yeah, I think that's right. Where you had the black man who drove through the Christmas parade and killed 6 people. And it's just been incredible to me to watch videos of, like, powerful people lie and talk about Kyle Rittenhouse shooting black people, which just objectively did not happen. Right. And then you have on the other side where, like, all the news articles talk about an SUV killed 6 people.
This accident, yeah.
Yeah, you know what I mean?
Meanwhile, he was speaking about killing white people.
Social media. Like, ranting about it. And it's like, it's just mind blowing to me that, like, more people aren't, like, disturbed by that, or more people can't see the differences in the way that things are reported. It's just like, yeah. I'm like,
this is what happens, is that it exposes the fact that it's not really about injustice. It's about furthering an ideology, right? What stories play into the narrative? Those are the stories we're going to elevate. Any story that doesn't go along with the narrative, then we have to diminish.
It's gone.
It's like when Kanye West, he put on a Trump hat, and I think Ta-Nehisi Jones said, "You're no longer black."
Right. Yeah.
Or when the Women's March in 2017 wouldn't let pro-life women have any official or affiliation with the march because they were pro-life. And they thought, well, is this a women's march or is this an abortion march? I thought this was a women's march, or you might as well, but it's about the ideology. It's not about supporting women.
Yep.
No pro-life woman is supported by the ideology.
No. No conservative black man or woman is supported by it either. It really is interesting. And I think it's a great way that happens. I think is the strongest way. You talk about critical theory, and I've been learning more and have been studying for the last year really more about critical race theory, and just how much that has just grown to dominate so much of society. And it's really, really sad to see. It's really interesting to me too. I'm interested maybe your perspective on this, of, like, watching white people almost in a certain way, like, self-sabotage. Like, to see that the majority, I watch all these, I love seeing, like, when Daily Wire or different places will send people, like, out to the streets of New York to talk to people. And one really good one I watched recently was they were, like, interviewing people on the obesity rates in inner cities, especially, like, in black communities and poor black communities. And every, like, white liberal that they asked said it was because of racism, it was because of all these things. And all the black people were like, well, they're eating bad food. You know what I mean? Like, they're not exercising. But it's like, it's so incredible to me, like, how, and I think it goes back to the push now of critical race theory to say that things like showing up on time, politeness,
Yeah.
you know,
Hard work.
yeah, hard work, right? Accountability are white. That's all white things. And it's interesting because you see that with the Waukesha driver, right? Like he's exempt because like as a black man, like I don't even have control over the words that are coming out of my mouth right now, right? Like I can't even be held responsible for any of this because
He couldn't help drive through the parade.
yeah, he couldn't help it. Like that's why the car did it. You know, it's almost like this crazy like level of racism that exists that
Yeah.
people are just incredibly blind to.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people are waking up to, I mean, along the same lines as that video you're talking about with showing ID to vote, voter ID. You know, they did the same thing where white people were like, well, you know, it's really racist. And then they went and interviewed a bunch of Black people and they're just like, I can get an ID.
Yeah.
They're like, are you capable of getting a driver's license?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I can.
How insulting. Do you know where the DMV is? Yeah. Do you know where the DMV is? And they're like, yeah, it's up on, 23rd Street or whatever. Wild. It's so, I mean, the president of the United States literally said, I was so amazed by this when they were talking about the voter ID law and how racist it all was. And he said that, poor Black and Hispanic people in the country, like rural Blacks and Hispanics, can't get their way to the DMV. I'm like, why can't it just be like poor rural people? Like, why are poor, like rural white people better than Black people finding the DMV and using the internet? You know what I mean? Like, why is it just them? It doesn't make any sense unless you literally are racist and you think that Black people are more dumb and inferior to white people. That's the only way that you can make
I almost think that that's how we have to start thinking about it. Calling it is like calling out CRT is racist. You know, I think we almost need not reverse racist. It's just racist.
Right. Yeah, it's really crazy. And just kind of drawing on of history. I was listening to Ben debate somebody on Bill Maher's show, and he was talking about, he's like, I just don't think that white people who never owned slaves should, have to pay Black people who were never slaves. Like we don't necessarily owe each other anything. You don't need to be held responsible for the actions of your ancestors, and thank God that we don't have to. My ancestors, I know my grandfather, and I've had all types of people in my family who have done terrible things, and I've done terrible things myself, and I'm glad that my grandchildren won't be responsible for my bad mistakes, but it's just really, really wild to me how, just how much it's shifted, but really how much it's the white people who are both championing actual racism towards Black people, but also rooting against themselves in a certain sense. Cause I'm like, if Kyle Rittenhouse gets convicted, I'm like, I told every white dude that I knew that day, I'm like, you would have been in some serious trouble because you could have caught yourself in a bad situation someday and gone to prison for life.
Yeah.
Like if the justice system's just done for white males, then that's a dangerous world to live in as a white man.
Right. And it's also just the most disempowering message you could give to someone, right? Like in no other context, when you're training someone to be a leader or mentoring them or helping them to transcend their circumstances, the first message you want to give them is like, you actually can. You can take responsibility of your day. You can take responsibility of your circumstances. Maybe you've been given a raw deal, whatever, a bad hand, whatever, and whatever your circumstances are, everyone has in some way, right? But the more you dwell on that, then the less powerful you become, right? You become an agent of change the more you believe that you can change.
Yeah, it's a literal Obama's original slogan, the yes we can. Like he literally had this kind of air about him. And even I even think of like, I remember Young Jeezy like made a rap song about Obama becoming president. And like it was so they were like inspirational, it was empowering, you know what I mean? Like that's how it started. And then his second term just took a huge U-turn, and he was just like, I did this, but none of the rest of you can make it. And there is just like this immense pride in these people, when you have like the Kamala Harrises of the world who are like Black people and women and all this stuff, like you just can't, like none of this is possible for you. And it's like, if you did it, why can't anybody else succeed?
Right.
Right. It's really crazy. But I want to talk about that's kind of a good lead in talking about racism to one of my favorite quotes that you had in here was from Martin Luther King. And you talked about it's a quote from Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And he quotes inside the quote saying, how can you advocate breaking some laws while obeying others? And he basically goes on to explain, some laws are just, some laws are unjust. The just ones come from natural law and from God, and the other ones are man-made. And so I want to talk about that a little bit because I'm really interested in this. This has been like top of mind for me lately. We just reinstituted all the mask mandate and things like that here in Denver. And, Emily was telling me about a priest in the diocese who apparently put out this letter that said, like as Catholics, we're called to follow the laws and to obey the government and things like that. And so therefore we should do this. We should go about and do this. And you could apply the same logic, I think, to the vaccine. You can apply it to a lot of things, right? That some of which would go against Catholic teaching. And so what is your kind of perspective on that in regards to some of the COVID things? Or if, let's say, we can address COVID first, like lockdowns or vaccine mandates or mask mandates. And then I also would love to talk about it in regards to like gender pronouns and things like that later on.
Yeah, I think that I would have loved, and in moving forward, if there are more mandates and lockdowns, my hope is that the church will really lead people to resist them. And I think that should be the church's role. It seems to me like at the beginning, we were all kind of confused, like, what is this? And we didn't really have a handle on it. But I think it's become clear that it's been so affected by politics in the way the policy has been pulled out. I mean, the way that they ignore natural immunity. I mean, these are irrational. I think that men and women, we really resist laws that go against reason. That's one of the, it's so hard for me to, swallow that type of thing, especially when I don't trust the fundamental entities that are leading us through this. They've proven themselves to be so deeply corrupt, so it's not like I have this like beloved authority figure who I know to be this good, virtuous person, and they're telling me something that doesn't make sense and I should obey it, right? That in that case, yes, I should. But these are deeply corrupt institutions that are giving us utterly irrational and imposition, imposing on our lives in ways that are, it means to not like saying that churches should close down. This is ridiculous. Saying the sacraments can't happen. Telling you have to inject something in your child. I mean, it goes so beyond the pale, I think, of the scope of their jurisdiction. But, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what I have not, I haven't studied deeply, what is the ethical response here, but these are just my thoughts off the cuff. So I advise everyone to talk to their spiritual director.
Yeah, amen. No, I appreciate you sharing that. And I think, one of the ways that I could get really pessimistic within the church world is I really struggle with, I don't know if respecting is the right word, but obeying at certain times, or just like, maybe just liking is the word, certain bishops and even priests. I think part of my difficulty is, just growing up. When I converted when I was 13. And so that was in 2006. And so, I mean, in the 2000s, like the sex abuse scandal that was happening. And then when I got into college is when like it broke out for Pennsylvania, did the grand jury, or their big report came out in Pennsylvania, which is where I'm from. And so all of that came out, and it was just like super difficult. And so like, I kind of get to this point, and like how I felt with this priest is I'm like, dude, like you guys, if you want me to listen to you and like buy this BS, in my opinion, that you're trying to sell me on like obeying the government, then you need to, as my leader, show me that you're willing to disobey the government when you ought to. And it's really hard for me going from last year, exactly what you just said. And not even just last year. I mean, we're coming up on 2 years of this, of where almost every single bishop and a majority of priests like obeyed the government, restricting people from the sacraments, restricting people, from getting together, from, that allowed this increase in depression, anxiety, and all these things to happen also within the church, suicide rates and addiction and all these things that have happened. And it's like, if you're not going to stand up when you ought to, when I think it seems very clear that you should, how can you expect me to now want to follow you and listen to you, to continue to obey them?
Yeah, no, it's a real struggle. I mean, I was talking actually more about obeying civil authorities than our bishops, but
right. No. Yeah, I think, but I think that was kind of like my transition from it is the bishops, when they tell us to, I struggle to listen to them because of the fact that I saw them obeying the civil authorities when they shouldn't have. You know what I mean? Yeah. I don't want to confuse that with what you said.
Archbishop Cordileone took some really strong, powerful, courageous stances, and some others too, and it's so heartening to see it, right? You're almost like, Father leading me. This is so good.
It's awesome. I think it's really good. But that's one of my struggles sometimes, is like, I'll hear of like, I almost have this like gut reaction. If I don't know a bishop or cardinal's name at this point, I almost feel like they probably don't stand up against anything, because I'm like, everyone, Archbishop Naumann in Kansas City, when he did, I've heard of Cordileone, his name a ton of times over the last 2 years. And it's like, if they're not standing up against abortion, if they're not willing to speak out at all about, communion, for example, to people like Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden, and if they're not willing to speak out against like the mandates and restricting the sacraments, you almost like it can be so disheartening, I think, as a Catholic, to watch so many just kind of cower in fear and go about their life. It's one of the things I have a lot of respect for. Archbishop Aquila here in Denver has actually come out and said, like I realized over the last several years, like I haven't been bold enough. He was like, I was just kind of going along and I thought I was doing the right thing. And he admitted that he hasn't been bold enough. He's making a lot of changes in the diocese, which has been really cool. But yeah, it can be so difficult.
Yeah, it can. We're doing something on Theology of Home for the past 6 months or so, where we pray for a particular bishop by name every day in our daily collection, our email. Just to because I think it was our idea of like, how can we change something that feels sort of discouraging into something that feels more hopeful. And I think that's, praying for them even by name can be such a good thing, because they're under such attack. Certainly the devil really wants to attack our bishops. But we're a divine institution and a human institution, and everyone's under attack. We're under attack, everyone,
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's one of the easiest ways, I think, that you can see, in the bishops and priests a lot of times, the same way with a lot of lay people, is I think there's just this overvaluing of our earthly life over our eternal life, and not recognizing that, yes, like some people might hate you. Yes, Pope Francis might get mad at you for what you said, or, certain people might leave your parish or get upset. But it's like, you have to, like, you don't exchange, goods here on earth and popularity here on earth for eternity, And I think that can kind of filter down through people, which is kind of goes back to what we said earlier about people not being willing to draw the line. And you can even see in the church how much we've lacked so much on things like divorce, on talking about marriage and different topics like that you wouldn't have seen, as much 100, 200 years ago in the church. And I think that it really has led to, the blurred lines for everybody. And that just kind of seeps out into the world and the way that we interact with the world, which is sad. You hate to see it. So, but yeah, so let's talk about, with that, talk about some of my biggest pessimism. How about, tell me about how you kind of feel about the future of the country, future of the church. Are you feeling optimistic? Are you pessimistic? I know some people think, like we're about to have a huge change. I know there's certain people who think that the tide's going to shift. Like, where do you kind of find yourself on that?
I'm actually a terrible prognosticator. It's just not something that people ask me questions similar to that sometimes. And I'm just not sure what to say, because I could see it going either way. I could see where the really dark road ahead of us, and part of the problem is because the woke movement does not have an internal limiting principle. They won't stop unless they are forced to stop. And part of that is just built into the philosophy, the Hegel stuff, like that Hegel, the society is all in one being that's in a process, building it, creating itself until it reaches its utopian ideal state. And so we keep having to like revolutionize, improve, and slough off the past. This is part of the reason why they hate history, right? Is that history is only a tool for the future. I think of it as like a man who has killed his father and is cowering, if terrified of his son, that all of the judgment is going to come at the end of history, and so you have to be on the right side of history or the wrong side of history. Well, this gives you a weird, crazy incentive to keep the progress machine going, keep revolutionizing, keep pushing the envelope until you destroy the envelope, right? Keep getting weirder until there's no longer man or women, but there's like, we're all just kind of one amorphous, like watery, like fluid, nothing. Amoeba. Anyway, so they're going to keep going, is my point, unless they are converted, or unless this movement is concluded and resisted in a strong enough degree. So I could see where it gets really dark, or I could see where, we build up a whole new like army of saints, and there's a renaissance of and vitality for what real human things. We rediscover a really human way to live, and that we want that. We don't want the dystopian metaverse. I don't know if you've seen that video. I saw that and I was like, what fresh hell is this? But that fact that anyone would long for that and not see how dystopian that is,
how terrible it is.
How terrible it is. And even you see signs of this, like even how like knitting people and like making bone broth, like all these old domestic crafts are coming back in style. I mean, it's a sign to me that people in some ways want a human way of life. Whether or not that's enough, it's not, certainly on its own, it's not enough, but it can be a seed that we can water and, can remind people you're a human being, you're a woman, you're a man, you're made for something, you have a purpose, you have something deeper,
Yeah, absolutely. No, 100%. I think that's really good. And I try to take the same kind of perspective of like, you're hopeful that things will improve and change, but you're ready in case they don't, like definitely am not banking on it. But going back to a little bit more politically speaking, like, do you have a lot of hope in like the Republican Party? Are you somebody who hopes to see DJT come back in 2024? Like, what do you think is going to be kind of the future of conservatism?
Yeah, no, I think that the old conservative establishment is probably pretty dead at this point. I don't think that if we try to run another Mitt Romney or something, then we're idiots and we deserve to lose, like that kind of, whatever type of politician is kind of over. But I don't know. I wound up really liking Trump in the second, I did not vote for him the first time. I did vote for him enthusiastically the second time, just because I saw more of where he fit in the, in this moment, and how important that was, regardless of his personal lacking. But whether or not I want him to come back, I don't know. I just want someone that is going to be kind of have all of the virtues he had, maybe without the vices, maybe Ron DeSantis or but I think that we have a lot of momentum. I guess my personal biggest concern is whether or not the election will be stolen. Because I don't know what happened in this last election, but there's certainly, I don't think it's crazy to think that there's cheating that happens. And I think that there is such a powerful movement that wants to remain with the elite culture that is in place. Right. And that is oftentimes a bipartisan elite group, and I think it's really powerful. And so I just don't know if they're just going to let another Trump type candidate win. I don't know. I mean, it's certainly, I think if Trump ran against Biden today, he would kill him, right? He would wax it. Right. There'd be no contest, no, who's enthusiastic about Joe Biden?
Yeah.
And even that feels like part of the power flex of the left, is that everyone knows that he's a horrible president. Everyone knows that he's a puppet, like no one really thinks that he's running the country, but we're all supposed to play this game like, okay, he's our president, like he's running the country, he's making decisions, who's actually making these decisions? I mean, the whole thing's so bizarre.
Yeah, who's behind it all? It is really interesting. Yeah, I'm a huge Ron DeSantis guy. I don't know if he should run in 24 or the next time or whatever, but I hope that he does someday, because I'd love for him to be the president of our country. But I think it is so good, and I think it's something I would also like to get your perspective on, is like I kind of draw a distinction between being Republican and conservative, and I think that has to happen now, especially because so many like libertarians or just really like classical liberals have like drifted over. You look at like somebody like Dave Rubin, for example, who he's married to a man, like I wouldn't call it conservative, where you're trying to conserve, Judeo-Christian values and like some of the fundamental things of the United States of America. But now they're kind of like in the camp of like Republicans. So how do you kind of distinguish yourself, or how do you kind of navigate that as well? Because
I lean towards what you're saying. I mean, I think that we have to become people who are aligned with people who understand what's at stake. And that's going to include people who don't have our same religious beliefs all the time, or don't have the same beliefs about what marriage is. But I think that the stakes are kind of further than that at this point, and we have to align and link arms with people who are going to see what's at stake and are willing to fight it.
Yeah, and the great thing I think about most of those people who do end up coming, who the left, when the left leaves people, which they inevitably do, because as you said, they're going to keep going, they keep getting wilder, is that most of the people who stay and like end up being either like center or becoming more conservative or become Republicans, they are open to dialogue, and so like they're open to like discussing things. There's not like the same kind of cancel culture, safe spaces. We can return to that, and that I think is a beautiful thing. If we can fight against woke ideology and then kind of have a conversation amongst ourselves of like, what is best, like what should we be doing, I think is really important. But do you ever share or kind of get concerned about like the right and like the conservative movement almost being like hijacked in certain ways by people who are kind of like very anti-conservative but identify as Republican?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's happened a lot, that it gets hijacked, and that seems like, and other people have said this, I didn't start this, but that the new battle lines is no longer a Republican or Democrat, it's elite, it's our elite ruling class, and like a more of a populist movement. And like you said, it's really attractive to me, the idea that, when like the Dave Rubins and, there, you could name a lot of those kind of more classically liberal people who come to the right or come to this cause. And it's so refreshing because you really can have actual discussions, and I think that that's been and maybe that's what unites us, is a willingness to be classical liberals, a willingness to actually be like, we actually want to have discussions and not be personally offended if we don't agree on every single thing, but also understand that our ability to disagree is one of the things that we're trying to preserve. And one of the things that this other side is trying to actually destroy. That I can't ask questions anymore, is a problem. That we tend to self-censor ourselves. These are problems. And we do this socially, like, it's not even just like the law saying you can't say him or say certain pronouns. It's now just like even my reputation will be at stake, or I'll lose friendships, or I might lose my job, these are the beginnings of totalitarian regimes. And that is so dangerous. And I think that that's what's so fun about the new conservative movement that's bubbling up, is that they hate that. And we just want to talk, and be able to have discussion. And that's a great thing.
It is. It's so good. And it's really crazy that we're still seeing all of that happen and people being okay with that, with like one of the most educated, generations of all time, or at least we have so much access to information, and we can like see the documentation. We still have, World War II veterans with us who like fought against this type of tyranny. And still, we see it kind of coming back around. I mean, it hasn't even been that long since the Soviet Union, was dismembered, and still we're kind of just diving right back into it.
Yeah. And think about how vital that is. You mean how alive that energy is? You know what I mean? Like, the new movement is going to be, there's so much life and energy around it. People are excited. They're free. They're free because they're not afraid of their being exposed as being a lie, right? Like, that's a fun thing about when you're oriented towards the truth. You're not afraid of things anymore, right? Because if you're going to get punished for saying the truth, if you're going to be scolded, if you're going to be wrong and have to reroute and rework your thinking because maybe you were off somehow, that's all on the table, and you're open to that because you're oriented towards the truth. If you're oriented towards ideology, you're constantly afraid. You're constantly afraid of being exposed. You're constantly defensive. You have to silence people. You have to coerce. It's a really stultifying way to be. Right. And I think that juxtaposition of this kind of stultifying ideological way of being versus this like really alive, kind of vibrant way of being is going to become starker and starker.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's so awesome. It is very exciting. It's obviously very nerve-wracking, you never know what's going to happen. But, I think that it is such a gift that we have our faith that really steadies us, and like the Holy Spirit. And I think when you do live by the truth, you don't have anything to be afraid of, and I think one of the final fears that I think our faith really eliminates in our lives is that fear of death. And when you can get past that and you truly do believe in the afterlife, you believe in heaven, you believe, in the grace of God, you believe in the sacraments, then I think that, what is there to be really concerned about? Obviously, you can still have righteous anger towards the things that are happening towards our children and towards people who are being brainwashed with this negativity and evil philosophy. But it is still beautiful at the end of the day to be able to rest and go to mass and go to confession and, and do these things together. And it's really cool. So hopefully we can leave it there on a optimistic note for most people.
Love it.
I've been talking about some negative things today, but awesome. Thank you so much, Noelle. Like I said, I thoroughly enjoyed the book for a number of reasons. I love the content that you had in there. I'm a huge lover of just the kind of high level strategy. I think it's kind of my love of like war strategy and things from my infantry days, but just love the kind of higher philosophical strategy and kind of seeing where the roots of those ideas and things came from. So really appreciate the way you broke that down, but also, again, just love the way that you wrote. I think you're a great writer on top of being a great thinker. And those two really go hand in hand and make for some great content. So thank you for sharing this with us. And thank you so much for joining me today to talk about it all.
Well, thank you. It's been true honor. And this has been a super fun, freewheeling and just joyful conversation. So I loved every second of it. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We hope to have you again someday. Someday we'll do one with you and Carrie. Maybe Emily can interview you about
and Emily too. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk to her.
Over here, Dave. All right. Thank you.